Good morning everyone, welcome to today's Jackanory, and it's a very special one today because it's our final part of George's Marvellous Medicine, our first Jackanory story. And you may remember yesterday we hinted at finding out what was going to happen to Grandma, who'd been watching from the rooftops while the Marvellous medicines were tried out and tested. Let's pick up the story, and this very final chapter, this final section, is called Goodbye Grandma. I hope you enjoy it. There's still something you've left out, son, Mr Cranky said. I can't think what it could be that I'm still leaving out of these medicines, George said. Oh, give it up, boy, said Mrs Cranky. Pack it in, you're never going to get it right. Mr Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked fed up as well. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous, tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted. So imagine she's huge. She's just come out of the roof by the crane and into the hay barn. What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with rats and mice, but I'll be blown if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. Oh, I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. Let me get you something straight away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Oh! She cried. Ha ha! So that's your little game. You look after yourselves all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a cup of morning tea, but you don't bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were selfish. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't tea. Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here, this minute. No, cried Mrs Cranky. No, Mother, don't. It isn't for you. Now you're against me too, my daughter, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having breakfast, trying to starve me. Mr Cranky looked up at the old horrid woman and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over now, George, like your father said. No, no, Grandma, no, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't, you're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs Cranky. That's George's Marvellous. Everything's George's around here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with George. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr Cranky was encouraging, grinning hugely. Only tea. No, the other two were saying, no, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp swallowed everything that was inside it. That was delicious, she said. Mother, wailed Mrs Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, And look what one tiny spoonful has done to that little old brown hen. Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle like a kettle. "This is going to be interesting, everyone," said Mr Cranky, still grinning. "Oh, now you've done it," cried Mrs Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything at all," Mr Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth, nose and ears, and whistling at the same time. "She'll feel better when she's let off a bit of steam," Mr Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs Cranky wrote. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Oh, we'd better stand clear then, everyone. Fingers in your ears." George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the old skinny hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Call the fire brigade! Call the police! Man the hosepipe!" said Mrs Cranky. "Too late," said Mr Cranky, looking rather pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head underneath the water straight away." But even as Mum spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller, just like the hen. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down quickly. "Oh, watch this, George, it's going to be good," Mr Cranky shouted, hopping round the yard as he did, and flapping his arms as he had been doing throughout this whole entire episode. "Watch what happens when somebody's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop there," cried Mrs Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. She kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Down and down she went. In another half minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" said Mrs Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes were no bigger now than little keyholes. They were blazing with anger. "How do I feel? How do you think I feel? How do you feel if you've been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," Mr Cranky said. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a pen, Mrs Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "Oh, how do I stop you getting smaller still, Grandma?" "You can't," cried Mr Cranky. "She's at 50 times the amount." "But I must stop her. I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and stretch it," Mr Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking. Then she was the size of a pin, then a pumpkin seed. Then, where's she gone? Cried Mrs Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr Cranky, rather insensitively. "But she's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and you're bad-tempered. You disappear. Great medicine of yours, George. Well done, son. I'm proud of you." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs Cranky kept wandering round with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? I can't find you. How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly. And by lunchtime she was saying, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house and a bit dirty and smelly after all, wasn't she?" "Yes, of course she was. She most certainly was all those things. Don't worry." George, meanwhile, didn't say a word and he felt quite trembling.
He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning in the cranky house and in the farmyard. And for a few brief moments he knew he had touched, with the very tips of his fingers, the edge of a magical world where magical things can happen. That's the end of George's Marvellous Medicine. It's a fabulous book. I hope you've really enjoyed it. We're going to start another book in Jackanory time next week. I really like this book because it has grotesque characters, fabulous language, it has comedy in there, it can be quite sad at certain times, and that for me is what makes it a memorable story that I've always enjoyed reading and sharing. I'll say one more time, it's really important that this, this is just a story, it's not real, and it isn't something you should try and make or do at home. That's very important. It's just a story and just there to make you laugh for that time. Please don't try and do any of the things that it suggests here in the book. But we've had a good time with George's Marvellous Medicine. I know lots of you have enjoyed it. So when Jackanory returns next week, we'll have another book to share and perform together. And I cannot wait. See you soon, guys.